not a webinar. It's more of a kind of roundtable event. So I'd encourage everyone to ask questions and, keep a really open dialogue. We do have a bit of an agenda, but, a sort of rough agenda really, with a few things to talk through that will hopefully be of value so we can maximize the time. But, of course, we can talk about other related sort of stories around the same topic and see where it goes. And we can look at doing some kind of spin-off roundtables and workshops and things to help solve some of the issues that maybe you guys have around this topic. So all of the bios have been sent round prior to the event, so we can jump straight in to the topics themselves. So we'll do that in a second. And I just want to also mention that some of the members here are part of HR. Sorry, some of the attendees here are part of HRCI, the HR Continuous Improvement body. So we're going to send around a link to HRCI after the event if anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about the accreditation as well. So with that, Becky, can I know, by the way, I know, Becky, you might have to jump off a little bit early, so I'll hand it to you first. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience when moving internationally, particularly around blind spots. I know from working with you in the past, some of the challenges you've had in Philippines, in Mexico. I wondered if you could kick off with some of those things to start off with.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Probably the biggest takeaway is that countries can be so different, even regionally. I mean, from Singapore to the Philippines, geographically sort of connect that all to Asia or ASPAC, but labor laws, cultural norms and customs, infrastructure, local infrastructure. One thing this made me think about is all of the natural disasters we have faced in the Philippines. I mean, we've had a volcano erupt, we've had multiple tsunamis. Well, that takes down your local business, right? When the entire country is flooded and underwater, or like in the case of the volcano eruption, I mean, we had people who had to evacuate their homes. And these are not things that typically executives are thinking about when they're, wanting to expand into a new area, country, or region. Typically you're looking at all of the cost models, potentially the labor models, employment laws. But I will, so the biggest takeaway is the people aspect. I mean, that can be an unknown denominator, and is something that we have faced many times. When you're really kind of looking at everything on paper, it doesn't always take into consideration some of those other things that do impact the business. And multiple times with the Philippine employees, we've had to switch into disaster recovery mode. How do we transfer all of that work to another region? Because it's not something they're choosing, or it's not around hiring or recruiting or cost. These are factors, beyond anyone's control. So that, as an HR leader, people leader, is something that I wanted to raise, since a lot of the focus is around business and meeting business needs, which is absolutely important. Similar things around cultural norms. Talking about blind spots. You don't know what you don't know. And so I was thinking about, what has led to the success when expanding globally for the organizations I've been with. And it's really around getting local resources. We are a big believer in engaging local employees. I know a lot of companies don't like to do that. It's a real top-down approach, roll everything from the executive and leadership down. But I've worked in organizations where we've also engaged from the bottom up, and that has been a big part of our success, because you do learn, a day in the life varies from region to region and even country to country. And those things are important as you're designing business strategies and, short, medium, and long term.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Becky. That's a really good opener, actually. So, I was going to come on to you actually a little bit later, Debbie, because I know that you're new to this. But you had one of the things that Becky just mentioned there is I kind of links up very much to what we were talking about a few weeks ago before this session, which was that your business is looking to expand internationally for the first time. And one of the comments you made was about how to expand from a cultural point of view. So I don't know if there's anything specific you want to ask Becky off the back of that, but I was definitely curious myself on, from culture is obviously quite a broad statement. So what other kind of components need to be thought about? But I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah. So actually, I do. Thank you, Chris. It's not so much. I mean, we have an EOR, so that processes all of our contracts and the legalities of time off and whatnot, vacation. But even just recently, we have one person in India. We're very small, start off. We're scaling up. We're not a new startup, but a scale up. And we only have one or two people in each of these various countries. So some benefits, some perks, some, rewards systems are not available if you don't have enough people in one country. So how do you kind of help provide those, just perks at work? We'll just throw that out. Perks at work doesn't cover India, doesn't cover, another country or two, but those people would like some benefits of that nature. How do you work around that?
Debbie, I have definitely been in your shoes. We have had a model where we had one or two in about 20 different countries around the world. And finding vendors who are interested in doing business with you is very challenging because you don't have the volume and the numbers, but you do have the complexity of need. And so the first thing is I can share some vendors that might work with you offline. We spent a lot of time. I mean, just finding an HRIS system was a challenge. Payroll processing, employer of record. I mean, that's great. That's a big step in the right direction. A lot of times, and this isn't necessarily, the first choice, but was doing a lot of just cash rewards or cash benefits, things you can put in the payroll because of simplicity. Trying to get someone an Amazon gift card in another country. I mean, all of the fraud protection, which is great, does prevent you from actually doing business with those companies and trying to expand that globally. At our current company, we had when it was your milestone anniversary, you got $100 gift card. So oftentimes, and this is not the first choice, but we would have employees buy their own gift cards and submit for reimbursement. And that is not great from a people perspective. I do think I have found some vendors since then that I can happy to share with you, one in particular, which was fabulous. Since COVID, there are more vendors out there. I will say a lot of them are US specific and working with US companies. The other thing is, depending on how flexible your employer record, the ones that I've worked with, especially the good ones, we're willing to explore and add on if we made a request and, of course, covered the costs and everything. We're willing to add things on.
Oh,
So what
okay.
we did was engage the employees and just more informational, not necessarily wish list, because that can pose some problems as well. But to find out if there's anything market competitive that you can offer. Typically an employer record would at least the ones I've worked with would absolutely want to have the discussion about it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
That actually, just if I can jump in, obviously we don't have our own workforce overseas. We advise on others like yourself, but just to echo what Becky said there, that's typically our approach. We will reach out to use our sort of local in-country partners to try and when you're talking about your typical insurance-based benefits, that's really tough because you don't have the economies of scale. And then trying to do it on an individual basis, it's very, very cumbersome in terms of administration. It's very cumbersome in terms of pre-existing conditions and exemptions. So you can end, it can take you a year sometimes to get a family, covered by some sort of health insurance. But the key thing is there are ways and means. when you do go into new locations, the key thing is to have, as Becky said, if you're hiring locally, work with those individuals, because they're such a huge source of sort of knowledge and information. And then obviously your professional services companies, whether it's EOR, whether it's your accountants, whether it's your HR advisory firms, they will all have people that they can sort of introduce you to. It's not all about sort of nickel and diming you as a customer. If we can assist you achieve something, just because we don't make any money out of it, it just means that it helps the overall relationship, and that's, I think, really key when you're going overseas.
Becky, can I just ask a follow-on question to this, actually? So one of the things that we're hearing in general, this is kind of it leads on from a question that came up in the employer of record and legal entity roundtable last week, which was selecting the right partners. So I'm going to ask kind of a general question, well, to you, Becky, or indeed anyone else who's had the experience doing this. Is there a sort of set amount of criteria that you will use to analyze vendors? Particularly when, like you said, you may not be that attractive to them in the sense that you don't have the volume for them, but you also need the high quality level of work. There's obviously a variety of kind of managed service, managed vendor type organizations out there across, all the different segments of services that you might need to expand internationally. So I suppose my question following on from that, to you, Becky, or indeed if anyone else wants to jump in, is how, what are the core basis, what is the core basis for that decision when, there's just so many vendors out there to sort of pick from?
One of the biggest challenge and the item we spent the most time when analyzing any vendor, whether it was HRIS, whether it was payroll, reward and recognition, certainly the cost model, the services offering, but also the level of customization or complexity that the vendor could handle was a big piece of it, because we did have 1 or 2 employees in 20 plus countries. That is a real challenge for many of the vendors. And so could they customize their solution, or could they handle the complexity of it? And so certainly cost models and things are important and typically are kind of the first checkbox, but there was a very secondary layer around the services, the countries, what kinds of things were going to be available. Because it's great to roll something out where 80% of your employees benefit, but what about that other 20%? It can create a very disparaging employment experience and can make people feel like they're second class or secondary. And it is not intentional. You don't want to do it. You're trying to do everything you can. But when you're limited on resources, funds, it's a balance, Chris. It's a real balance. On how to meet the needs of all of your employees.
I think one of the observations that I had just briefly is that there's, when you're looking, this is, again, it's a general comment because we're looking across different segments here, but it's in this case, when we were talking about it in last week's employer of record legal entity roundtable, Becky, you were talking about very set criteria you would use to ask an employer of record in order to qualify their capability, basically. And I think this comes down to one key point, which is that obviously all the vendors want to sell you a solution. So the key from a buyer's point of view is understanding what the right questions are in order to kind of drill down into what the real capability is versus maybe what's being positioned. So that's something I've seen a lot. And of course, what's happening in the market at the moment is you've got more and more vendors popping out in different segments, because international expansion's got bigger and bigger since COVID especially. So it's actually becoming harder and harder to kind of select different partners. And actually that bridges on to something else you mentioned, Debbie, and there is actually a separate roundtable in a few weeks on this, so maybe we can save the the very detailed analysis of this. But you touched on HRIS platforms, and there's a couple of key things that seem to be coming up in people's feedback. One is HRIS platforms, how to what to migrate to, what to ask, how to migrate, the whole big kind of question around what you need to do to make that slightly large decision when moving systems. And the other that you touched on was around kind of rewards. So I mean, as I said, we've actually got some separate sessions on that, but I don't know if anyone wants to comment specifically on the reward side, or indeed any experience they have on the HRS side when kind of moving their business to, you know, to a new system.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from our perspective, where we're helping sort of customers, you know, identify and you know, utilize a common HRIS system. That's the age-old issue I think we've been struggling with for the last 20 years. You know, we've got you've got the main players, you know, that are super expensive, and when you're a relatively sort of, you know, small startup with a handful of employees going into a location, it really is sort of cost prohibitive to kind of utilize those systems. You know, the US, the headquarters, may have the head count where it justifies that sort of cost and investment, but when you're going into, you know, as Becky mentioned and as Debbie mentioned, when you've got 1 or 2 employees in a location, that can really and you know, we're actually going through that very thing right now with a customer, and you know, they're only in sort of 13 locations, headquartered in the US, and trying to go through that beauty parade where we're reaching out to various different providers, looking at their technical capability, speaking with the customer, then we're having various demos, then we're looking at the commercials. And even though it's a relatively small number of, you know, countries in the world, there's seldom 1 or 2 that can actually do everything that the customer wants. So there's always that sort of compromise.
So Becky, just one more question from my side, because I just wondered if you could touch on a couple of key points relating to some of the countries and some of the nuanced things. One of the things that entertained me a little bit was around when I think you moved into one country, I think it was the Philippines from memory, and you had some issues around you know, people not being able to access good Wi-Fi at certain times of day, and you know, had to come up with some workarounds to help those employees and those sorts of things. But I suppose my question was geared towards: are there any kind of 2 or 3 specific examples of things that have come out of the woodwork that maybe you weren't expecting when you were moving into a new country?
Definitely. So I think the biggest thing is being open and flexible to the possibility. You know, you hear you're only limited by your imagination. When we, you know, have experience, so in the Philippines, the internet tends to drop all day long. And so during COVID, everybody was working from home, and that was very unstable. So what we learned was we had to buy these very special devices, not expensive, that connect to the cell phone towers, and you reloaded them each month with minutes. So when the internet dropped at home, the employees could connect to the cell phone tower device that we purchased and continue working. So that was not something, you know, anyone would have ever anticipated, expected. Certainly, you know, the country has many large employers, but when you took everyone out of offices, that really threw a wrench in the infrastructure and drained the local system. I would say, you know, when we moved into Mexico, I mean, Belgium was one where we've had a lot of interesting things around cars, car allowances, and those kinds of things. You don't typically, that feels very outdated in the United States, right? But I would say, so the biggest lesson was make sure you're talking to lots of different people. If you rely on 1 or 2 resources, you're kind of getting a narrow view. In Mexico, you know, the compensation structure, you have about 15 different line items that go on the paycheck each month. Again, in the US, it's, you know, pay. You know, you've got 2 or 3 things, or in Mexico, they have pay plus, 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 plus. And it's just, it's it's something very cultural that we say, well, we want to throw it all into the pay line item. No, that's not culturally how it works. And so from a people leader perspective, is being flexible, kind of open-minded, and asking a lot of different questions around just what is the right way to approach offers, employment structures. There is the legal and the business aspect, but there is this whole other part that, can be a blind spot that, many times like, okay, we've got to pivot. We've got to pivot real fast so we can meet this need. So, when we purchased those cell phone towers, I mean, there was no, a lot of time to really debate whether we wanted to do it or not. It's we got to move. Otherwise, we're really kind of hindering the employees' ability to be successful and continue, working uninterrupted. So I think a lot of it also is mindset. And part of the change management is around the executive team and just keeping the leaders, because the leaders will hear something, they'll say, oh my gosh, can't get caught up on that detail. You've got the change management part from the HR leader is every country's different. We're going to have to be flexible and agile. And as much as we want to create a consistent employment experience with a consistent set of benefits, there will be variations from country to country, and just getting really comfortable with that environment and kind of the ambiguity of what the future faces. I would say, from a leadership perspective, it's also an element of risk, because there are some unknown things as you're expanding globally. It might sound really great and look really great on paper, but in practicality might not really match. And so just being willing to kind of keep an open mind about that and what needs to be done to make it successful. It looks different in every country. Some it's very different, some it's slightly different. I'm not sure if that helps or not, Debbie, but those are the things I think about from an HR leader perspective.
It doesn't, even the term agile, agile and flexible, to turn on a dime, when new information is received, and, it's not just holding on to one fact, one tidbit, one expectation. So no, thanks. It's a good reminder.
That's really good. And actually, Liz, I know you're on the call. I haven't said hello yet. Hi, Liz. I was going to come on to a question sort of related to what Becky was saying, because I know from talking to you that you've had some sort of questions that come from your CEO at times, or other people around, before you move into a country and the business has a need to, to go from one place to another. Maybe you can kind of comment on this, because, from an HR perspective, how do you kind of see what's to come? I know you've had a few issues in the past yourself to deal with when you've gone into a country and a few unexpected surprises have come out of the woodwork.
Yeah, no, Chris, I've talked to Chris a ton about this, where I do work in a startup environment. That's my kind of caveat. And the business can want to do things, but they put the cart before the horse. And so a big gap for me is making sure I'm part of the conversation upstream, as always. It's so just constantly reminding leadership. But to that point, having tools to educate my leader, especially like my CEO. So before we're even considering business in a certain area that ultimately could even involve potential headcount, PO or otherwise, knowing what some of the risks could be. I mean, sometimes most of the time, honestly, I should say, you don't really have a choice. Like if there's a business need, you're going there and then you kind of figure it out. But, as a business, we're looking, this has been the case, you're looking at something like building a manufacturing facility, and it could be one of 3 different countries. Of course, cost to build X, Y, and Z is going to be the main driver component. But if there's essentially 3 equal-ish options from a business standpoint, are there things that would be advantageous to know as an employer? Because in this case, hiring under one or the other could honestly just be a lot less complicated or a lot more advantageous to us as a business. Hopefully that kind of follow my train of thought. But, and Chris has been on this journey with me personally when it comes to hiring and then all that comes from it. But it's just a constant cart in front of the horse. And so I was joking, I was like, if there's this cheat sheet, so the second I even hear the word Singapore or Saudi Arabia or whatever it is, I can whip out my little file card and go, oh, let's just make sure we're aware of these things. Especially any like big burning, like, oh, you might actually want to reconsider even essentially touching this country from an employer standpoint because of X risk. So Yeah, having that magical cheat sheet, if such a thing exists.
I was just saying that you brought that up kind of similarly last week, actually, and when we went through the transcript and everything, that's something we're looking at. So bear with us. We're going to come up some ideas around how we can create something anyway relating to different countries to look at least to a certain degree of detail before you kind of look at it on a case by case basis. And actually, I think, to be honest, I think this is something that's been mentioned by a lot of other people as well around the complexities. Alan, this might be a good thing for you to jump in on. I'm just trying to find you on my screen here, but specifically around the employment side and employment risk. I don't know if you've got anything to add around that.
Yeah, so I'm head of TA deal, and we've obviously started in a we've got over 100 countries that we're operating in the sense of working with clients or our own headcount. I think there's like maybe 3 challenges that I think that companies that we see and we partner with typically tend to make kind of similar mistakes, right? So some of those mistakes they start with 1 or 2 people outside, right? So, oh, hey, like there's this engineer in Mexico, we're just going to hire this person. Oh, the second one comes along, or the third one. Oh, now there's another one in Mexico, same time difference, or Brazil, or wherever it is. And they don't necessarily think about like the different the different complexities that come very quickly, right? So this relates to culture, this relates to communication, this relates to transparency, this relates to cultural norms, currency fluctuations. It can a number of different things. The different benefits that I think people people kind of started on, all of these things. So I think you have to be very intentional if you are going to build out a internationalization kind of strategy. Don't wait until you've got 10, 15 people before you start to think about a strategy, right? Be very intentional at the very start, because if you're putting your toe in the water, you hire 1 or 2 people and then you see how it goes, it tends to lead to further complications a little bit later, right? So that's kind of number 1. Number 2 is you need to really think outside the box, not inside the box, right? So often we get a lot of clients that say to us, hey, well, we can't do this, but we can do this, but we can't do this. Do we want to do it? Yes, no, all of these things, and a little bit kind of indecisive, right? And I think that you probably one of the best practices that I see a lot of companies do with us is really start to mirror companies that they kind of admire, right? And aspiration, where do they want to be? How do they then get there? How do they think about, different examples? There's numerous examples of companies that have started in the US or the UK or Europe or wherever and started to expand into Latin America or into APAC on all of these things, sharing best practice. That I think that who was it? It was not Debbie, but the lady before. I think she just dropped off. Around telephones and SIM cards and all of these things, and just really understand the implications of going to one market or another, right? And then the third component is the trend is happening, right? We see a lot of different clients kind of either resistant to it, not resistant to it, all of these different things. But especially with what we tend to see is that I'm in a tech environment. I've been in kind of tech startups for kind of a number of years. And we typically tend to see in the tech environment a number of different trends. So in the good times when there's VC capital and there's kind of growth opportunities and there's profits, all of these things, then you start to look at the top line growth, right? And then when markets constrict, you start to look at your bottom line, right? And your cost. And what a lot of companies are doing as a competitive advantage is looking at cost base and how do you evaluate competencies of a software engineer in San Francisco, a software engineer in Czech Republic or in Mexico or in Brazil, and you start to look at bottom line, and then you start to have a look at that cost comparison versus complexity. And that's where a lot of competitive advantage is currently being seen at the moment in order to level the playing field in terms of opportunity for access to great roles, but it has various different upside and downstream implications of cost, complexity, all of these things. So just to repeat, be very intentional, strategic in your approach. Think outside the box. Think of the different avenues that are there, and consider the growth opportunities for, you know, growing in the good times, but also kind of managing your and hedging your risk with some of the constricting markets that we see.
One of the, just building on your point, Alan, one of the questions that I have in my mind is coming back to like looking at the sort of the international expansion market as a whole. To me, there seems to be, and I'd just love to get everyone's opinions on this to see if they feel the same or differently, is that there's a lot of the points you raised there, Alan, were to do with, you know, thinking ahead on all these different sort of topics. But I think other than some of the very large consulting firms that are, you know, out there and very expensive and so on, there doesn't seem to be much, at least by way of advisory or guidance, that sits in that middle layer to help HR leaders and other similar people responsible for international expansion to actually solve some of those problems, and, you know, kind of be on their side and act as the good guy to help them choose vendors, decide where to, or sorry, the other way around, decide where to go, choose vendors, you know, all those other components. I would love to get anyone else's thoughts around this, but this is something I've just personally observed that kind of dovetails onto your point, Alan, really, about all the things you have to think about. Has anyone got any thoughts around that?
I'm gonna note all my commentary questions before. I'm noting, having unfortunately learned from the experience and a woulda, coulda, shoulda situation, and I just like offer the example of course, when you're going to hire, the things you're not thinking about is, what if we have a reduction in force? What if this shuts down X, Y, and Z? That's so not the mentality. And of course, you know, you need all these things to even get an employment agreement together. But I'm operating from, you know, also from a California-based tech startup. So Americanized view, at-will employment, all these things that in many countries are very, very different. And so just to have even been able to have had the conversation early on with my CEO, whomever it is sure, the cost of labor, for example, in Singapore is very different than that in San Francisco. But lo and behold, gosh forbid we were to have a layoff or need to part ways or whatever it is, this is what the cost is going to be to exit, or things like that. So as I noted, though, oftentimes the business has made a decision, so you just have to work with it. But to have had those kind of purview, and that's just like one example, almost like a partial cheat sheet, but also like a bullet point of things we should be thinking about. And Chris, to your point, I well, actually having worked with you was helpful. There was not really a very, very helpful resource. So I'm curious if other folks have felt otherwise.
I just have one thing. I'd love to know if anyone, what I've certainly found is there are some advisors now that sit in that layer that say, you know, I can help you decide on your provider in legal entity setup or payroll or whatever, but nobody who, you know, not nobody, but a limited amount of availability of organizations that help sort of more of the strategic advisory until you get into that kind of very high level stuff. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to comment, Chris.
Yeah, just from that perspective, obviously we've been in this, Nikki and I, that is, been in this arena since, well, early 2000s. And there was a big sort of push for, you know, global consulting firms to support mainly California-based sort of tech startups, which we were involved with. But I think what's happened, all those businesses that we were part of in the early 2000s, and that we helped grow, they've obviously all been snapped up, and there's been so much acquisitions going on in the last 20 years. Obviously, we sold our business as well as part of that. So whereas previously you had a lot of these sort of fairly sort of relatively small businesses, but they were equally as agile as the startup community. They weren't these big corporates, but they had that sort of experience and knowledge about doing business internationally. A lot of them have all been swept up. So what you're having now is, as you say, there is a gap. There are a lot more sort of businesses being set up to try and fill that gap. But I just think there's a bit of a kind of a time delay before a lot of those businesses sort of become more visible, I guess, to the mainstream.
Yeah, very interesting. That's kind of, consistent with what I've seen. I've been in the international expansion business a little bit less time than you, Chris, but certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, that's where I've seen the same thing. There's just a gap in that middle section, really, where people are struggling to get that guidance.
But in addition to that, a lot of the people that I work with back in the sort of near or the what were they, high street partners days, they employees of those businesses that gained that knowledge left and set up, likes of Nicole, who's now the, who founded GP. You've got, Ben from Velocity. So we all kind of worked together, and their roles at that time had nothing to do with EOR. They were just in that sort of marketplace. So even though those sort of advisory businesses that provided advice, guidance on payroll, entities, the finance, HR, they are not around now, but they have pivoted into sort of new businesses, like the EOR market. So it's definitely an interesting sort of place to be.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I'm sure it will continue to develop. Certainly, the last couple of years, things in this general ecosystem of international expansion I've seen it, change in the space of 18, 24 months, and to an unbelievable level. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of change in the next few months as well. I just wanted to kind of move on as well. So, Christy, where are you on my screen? There you are. Hi. Thanks for joining us today. I know just before, a couple of hours ago, I know you signed up. I think it was yesterday, and you sent me an email through today talking about some insights you wanted to get in relation to compliance on a global scale. You touched on some new countries that you're moving into, and that you guys have a new HR organization. Do you want to kind of expand out on that and see, how anyone on this call might be able to help you?
Yeah, sure. So our company, we have legal entities in the UK and in New Zealand. But again, our HR department is brand new as of last year. The company's been around for about 15 years now, but was very small. So we're definitely in a growth phase now. We're at like 80 employees. We had 35 last summer, like at the same time. So the headcount has really increased. Coming in, not personally having a lot of global experience, like none. It's just been, it's challenging to kind of understand where to go for information. We don't use an EOR. We do have a global HRIS system that we've settled on that we're very happy with. But it's just, not knowing what you don't know. And I was, I didn't really know what to expect from this experience today. Just, here to, if I could take away something, then that's great.
And I would like to add, Christy, I was right where you were, in March. I started with this company and we were going global. I've never had international exposure for hiring or anything. When I came on staff, we had an HR consultant that we hired specifically to help us do that. And, it is a per hour cost. It's not, it's not dreadful by any means, but, they did an interview for somebody who can handle international challenges and know the resources. And he brought in a ton of resources, a ton of knowledge. And he was here from October of last year until August of this year. And it was a perfect time frame. So it was a really good resource for us, and not too expensive to do it that way. So if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're kind of I think we're finally good on our US compliance. We have everything in place there. We're in 10 different states in the US. So I think we're finally in a good place there, and just starting to tackle the UK is sort of up next. And just kind of working through all of those different pieces. It's just myself and another person here. It's a lot. Like I said, just all the different compliance and like you guys have spoken to today, that everything is you know, very regionally based. Even though we're in the UK, we're in different regions in the UK, and it's just, it's a lot to digest. It's a fantastic learning experience. I think, you know, maybe we'll be the creators of cheat sheets by the time we're done navigating all of this stuff. But yeah, so that's, you know, that's why I joined today, just try to, if there was something to be learned, you know, to kind of take it all in. So thank you for allowing me to join you.
No, it's great to have you, Christy. Debbie, I was just going to ask you a follow-on question from that. The HR consultant that you mentioned, did they have, you know, I'm just curious of the general kind of skill set or knowledge areas I suppose they had. Was it quite general at a strategic level, or was it more tactical, you know, what countries to go into and why, and what service providers, or a mix? I'm just curious what worked so well.
Yeah, it was a mix. He worked for large organizations that were spread out across the world as a CEO, he was also had a finance background as well as an HR background. So he was a CFO, a CEO, the HR, you know, avenue. He just was well-rounded and had a lot of, he didn't have too much specific knowledge about each different country, but he had exposure to most of the countries. One in particular ran away with, you know, don't have anybody employed in France. Just don't do it, you know. So, but other than that, we were relying on our EOR company to give us, you know, that kind of detail on different countries. But he was a gold mine of resource for the U.S. He's based in the U.S., so, you know, but he had worked with international companies and at an HR level, so he had a lot of knowledge, a lot of resources, a lot of companies he's worked with, and he was able to narrow down the ones that just wouldn't be able to, you know, handle it or give much to it. So
it sounds like we need to get his number, Debbie.
You know what? I forwarded all of your bios to him this morning. I'm like, you need to meet these people.
Do you know what's funny, Chris? I just put a note down to Emma here to say we need to get in touch with the HR consultant that Debbie's used. So I might actually take you up on that, Debbie.
We're hiring, so we need some more support. So that we'll take that.
This person will be getting approached for jobs left, right, and centre after this call. I wonder what hit them. No, that's great. Victoria, I can see you've made a follow-on comment about France, which I think often comes up in my experience, but I'm curious to hear more about your perspective.
Having tried to terminate an employee in France, which took, I think, 2.5 years, that just basically they're so one-sided, and the practical application of administering even employees throughout is just a nightmare. And I'm in a different company now, and it's one of our growing emerging sales markets. And I keep just saying, please don't hire anybody in France. Hire them anywhere else covering France regionally. It's just, it's so impractical and so biased, and every action is so extended. It makes it very difficult, particularly if you have a small team, to effectively manage the business in that area. And that's that connectivity between the HR role, but also the business, because you can't replace them. You can't find somebody else to do the job while they're not doing the job. And that's really the impact on the business that I would say is the most prominent.
Yeah. France, along with a couple of other sort of locations, are difficult to manage from an employment perspective, but it is doable. There's a lot of good business done in France. There's a lot of successful businesses. So what I would say, approach with caution, but don't be 100% put off, because, you know, it is sort of has a lot of good experienced people. Yes, you have to pay a pretty penny for them, and when you do exit, it can be cumbersome and expensive. You know, I mentioned last week's roundtable where we did one lucky individual was the recipient of 1.8 million euros worth of termination fees after a termination went wrong. It's difficult, but there are loads of horror stories, but there's a lot of good things that can happen in France too. It's just, you know, what we're all talking about today is making sure that you've got good advisors around you that can, navigate the rules, regulations, so that you can operate your business successfully in location. And, that's why we are here after 23 years. And, it doesn't get any easier. The laws change, practices change. And we just have to kind of evolve and develop our advice and guidance to help those businesses succeed in those countries.
Those of you that are in startups in different countries or have a few employees maybe in countries spread around the globe, how do you stay current on compliance issues? As you know, things change drastically and can change drastically overnight. Having worked globally, I know this is a concern a lot of organizations have. I mean, things change dramatically overnight in the United States and different states, but globally, if you have 1 or 2 employees in different countries, how do you stay current with what's happening from a compliance perspective?
So that I actually mentioned in the comments is we use the law firm Littler, and they are global, and they do regular regulatory compliance updates that push to you, so you don't always have to go looking for it. And then they have regional summaries, so it'll be like all of Asia, all of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and you can download those summaries each month, and it tells you what's going on by country. And I found those to be hugely helpful. If we're not hearing about it from the people, we have slightly larger operations than it sounds like some of the other areas. So usually we have a manager or something we can rely on to kind of keep a pulse locally, but that's the way I do it. I'm sure there are other organizations that provide those types of updates, but I have not been disappointed with the support that Littler provided, particularly in those global regulatory updates.
That's exactly how we operate our business, Victoria, in that sense, is that we have relationships with our law firms that do exactly that. And it's not just the changes in law either. You can have sort of case law decisions that, not an actual legal change, but it does influence how, businesses can operate or the outcome of a certain event. So those are the things that I'm sure Littler will also provide regularly if there has been a case law decision that, as I say, doesn't affect. Yeah, and that's super important. It's obviously, if you're doing it on behalf of your own business, it's important, for people like sort of like us, where we're advising customers on going internationally. It's doubly important because obviously our advice is only as good as the data and the rules and regulations that we have, at our fingertips. So that's why we pay a ridiculous amount of money each year to the law firms in each country to make sure that we're one step ahead and not one step behind, because that's when you can fall foul of some expensive litigation or penalties from the government as well, or the labor offices, or work councils or unions. So it's definitely a great valid point there, Victoria.
I think the market is also being updated, right, in the sense of AI and how that plays a role in sense. So, I mean, we're very lucky. We've got an amazing tool called Ask Alicia, which downloads on a live basis case law, but also the law in general, and ChatGPT style questioning, so you can relate specific examples to specific terminations, what country to go in, etc., and be able to get live updates based on as good a question as you ask gets a good response back, and if you ask a generic question, you get a generic kind of response back. So this is something that we're pretty excited about, especially in combination with EOR and a number of other factors, right? So that's a big growth area for us.
Yeah, interesting stuff. We just, and I was going to mention as well. Well, I was actually going to mention this in the kind of roundup at the end, but we're setting out. We've got a few more roundtables that we've set out for the next few weeks. But we're also now looking at new topics moving into the new year, where we're doing a second series of roundtables. So this one is a block of 6, and then we've got in the new year some others. And but just really want to mention, we'd love your input as to what you would like them to be and some of the common themes that are coming up. So, for example. The France thing actually is quite interesting. I hear that all the time, specifically on France. There's no reason we can't do specific groups and roundtables on individual countries. So coming back to Liz's points about, cheat sheets, that might be one angle, but probably won't solve everything. Alan's talked about the AI side, but maybe actually getting together and going through some of these countries as and when people have the need to do them might be interesting. The other one that seems to come up all the time is compliance, which you guys have obviously just talked about. So we'll probably look at those two. If anyone has any other thoughts or ideas you either want to share now or separately to this meeting about any additional topics that you want us to cover or set up in the new year, do let us know, because we're just starting to build it out at the moment. So that would be really useful. Just before we kind of round up, has anyone got anything else they want to add? Naomi, I don't know if you have any questions or if that was useful to you potentially.
Thanks, Chris. It was pretty good, but it also confirmed that the approach my company has been using is aligned with what you're saying. We're 100-year-old, 101 actually, based in Jamaica, headquartered in Jamaica, but we've branched out into the US, Canada, UK, and we have operations in Guyana and in the region, Caribbean region. So some of the things you spoke about that was shared about an HR system, yes, we went with one of the big players, so we use success factors, and we're rolling out across the different territories. We've also gone with an approach of global yet local. So we pay a lot of attention to the local, needs, and we support our efforts by aligning with global law firms. As was said, we use someone in a company in the UK that helped us through some challenging employment situations. I didn't have any France, but I've had a few UK. The regulations are very strict, and I had my first GDPR challenge from an employee for exercising their right for data subject access. That was pretty challenging. I never had that before. So we've drawn the support, and we also, as I'm heard talking, we get we have a compliance audit done. We are a publicly listed company, so we do a lot of governance. One of the strategies we use as well is when we select our board members, we try to bring in persons within the market as well with expertise, legal and financial, to support their approach. One of the other areas I heard mentioned was, we went into some markets with individuals, and I now have a couple challenges of employees saying that you sent me to this market. The retirement plan that I have is, it was not supported when I was in this market, or it was not adequate. And so I now have a challenge to get the actuaries to reassess and to see, because we promised them that they would not be worse off. So quite a bit of what you've been saying, I've experienced, and right now, and the approach reviews as well in our expansion is to acquire companies. So we didn't go greenfield, so that sort of helped. We definitely had to look at the talent and do a lot of due diligence before going in. And in some cases, we kept some of the existing leadership for a while to help us through the integration. And if they didn't fit, then we moved on without them. But, that's a strategy we have used. So the area that I had hoped to delve into a little bit more, but time perhaps doesn't allow for this one, was just how do you plan strategically for a workforce when you're looking to go into a market? So we want to do further expansion, but we don't have the expertise to support it. What strategy do we use? Looking outwards, So if we did acquire a business in another month, or let's say 6 months, how do we quickly staff up, or how do I plan from now to have enough people ready to support? So that's kind of where I wanted to explore. Hope I've added some value as well.
Sure, I might actually be able to help at least answer the last part of the question. So my background prior to HRConnect was in recruiting for a number of years, and a few key points I can at least add on the acquisition of talent, but I'm sure other people may come up at it from a few different angles. Just to mention, Naomi, I know we're coming close to time now, and a few people have had to drop off, so we can carry on this conversation afterwards as well if we people have to jump and we run out of time. On the recruitment side, I actually think it's fairly straightforward. It's a straightforward answer, not straightforward to do necessarily. I think it's, first of all, you talk about moving in 6 months, and people often underestimate the amount of time it takes to actually, from, knowing what skills and talent you need right the way through to running the hiring process and actually onboarding the people in different countries. Some countries have 2-3 month notice periods, those kind of things that not everyone knows about, especially if you're used to hiring domestically, for example, in the US, where, things are a lot quicker. There can be a lot of nuances there. So I think the first thing is timing. The second thing is, and we could probably do a whole section on this, but looking at the skill set of the individuals, where to actually acquire the talent, but then also starting to look at some of the more complex issues. So people will often say, well, I'm moving, I'm looking to expand for a certain skill set, and I'm considering these countries, but they may not consider a number of factors that are really important, such as the attrition rates in certain countries are so much higher than others, which means you don't get the continuity that maybe you would like, even though maybe salaries are far lower. Obviously, then you have the recruiting costs, which are high when there's attrition. You have, there's lots of kind of subcomponents to actually make the decision on using the talent availability in the talent marketplace to actually help guide that decision on where to move in the first instance, if there is a choice of countries, depending on what the business need is. When you actually get into the thick of hiring, I think a couple of other key points before we go on to other areas, because as I said, I think there's a number of areas here. One is the ability to understand where the talent exists. The other is to look at different ways of employing people, and looking at we've already touched on some of these points, like some of the risks around employing in certain countries rather than others. So those are just some of the things to think about. I think there's probably a few more, but no worries. I'm just mindful a few people are having to move on to their next calls and so on. So just to round up, really, I'll keep it brief. Just to say thanks again for attending. We would absolutely love your feedback. We've had a couple of notes in the comments, so thank you for that. But if you could take time to fill out the survey, greatly appreciated. We're constantly focused, Emma, myself, and the team, and Sam, who's on here, to constantly improve these roundtables and look at, like I said, new topics. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. I will be sending around follow-up requests for a conversation if you're available. You're not obliged to, of course, but if you want to talk about some of these issues in a bit more depth in a sort of more private setting to see what kind of support or help you might need to further your international expansion plans, we can help you do that. And finally we have some other roundtables coming up in the next few weeks, leading up towards the beginning of December, I think is the last one. So we'll share those with you, with the group, and if you'd like to attend any of them, if you're not already signed up, then do let us know.